Have you ever looked at a picture of an object at an extremely high level of magnification? At first, it's completely unrecognizable, but the more you zoom out, the more it begins to take on shape and dimension. And as it zooms out even further, it becomes even more familiar until you eventually recognize the object. At that point, it seems so obvious what it was. Why didn't you recognize it at first? Maybe it was because you were so caught up in the details that you couldn't see the bigger picture, so to speak. How does this same problem sometimes affect how we study the Bible? Let's find out in this week's 5-Minute Torah. At this point, I'd normally say, welcome back, Torah Tribe. You're watching the channel that connects disciples of Yeshua to the eternal Torah of God. However, because I've just made the transition to the Shalom Macon channel, maybe I should say something like, welcome back, my Shalomies. Anyway, I'm going to give a brief overview of this week's Torah reading before I dig into what I introduced at the beginning of this video. This week, we are studying the portion of Terumah, Exodus 25:1 through 27:19, and here are the three things that you need to know about it. Number 1, supernatural design, learning to read the blueprints. This week's portion begins with God telling the children of Israel to build a house for him. It would be a portable house where he could meet with them until they reached the land that he had promised to give them. This temporary dwelling would be called the Mishkan, from the root shakan, which means to dwell. Some people find this Torah portion to be one of the most challenging to make it through, but our enjoyment of the Torah portion really depends on our perspective. Let me give you an example. A few years back, I mentioned something to one of my sons about that week beginning this Torah portion, the portion of Terumah. He just got this big smile across his face. I said, "What's up?" And he said, "This is one of my favorite Torah portions." He was probably 16, maybe 17 at the time. When I asked him why, he said it was because he enjoyed reading about all of the intricacies and details of the tabernacle and how it was to be built. It just goes to show that God put something in the Torah for everyone, and we need to give it a chance to find the particular thing that we are drawn to as we study this monumental revelation he has entrusted us with. Number 2, tabernacle furnishings, a lesson in holiness. After letting the children of Israel know that he wanted them to build a holy house for him, God gave Moses all of the instructions to build the furnishings of the tabernacle. These included the ark that would hold the commandments Moses received from God atop Mount Sinai, the table for the bread of the presence, and the golden menorah. The instructions for each of these items were given with precision and required the skills of an expert artisan to bring them to life. But yet, each of these items would function within the holy tabernacle and would not be seen by the general public. They would only be seen by the Kohanim, the priests, in their daily duties. The Ark of the Covenant would only be seen once a year and only by the Kohen Gadol, or the high priest. So why did they need to be so precise, so intricate, so beautiful? Because their nature had to reflect the nature of the one whom they were to serve. They had to be holy, unique, and set apart, like the God they would serve. We can learn a lesson from these furnishings within the Mishkan, or the tabernacle. In our service of the Lord, we can either try to bring God down to our level or purify ourselves so that he can draw us closer to his level. Number 3, outer courts, the holy business of God. The last things God instructed the children of Israel to build in this week's Torah portion were the bronze or the copper altar and the partition that would surround the outer courts of the tabernacle. The bronze altar would be the most used item inside the tabernacle courts, with multiple sacrifices being burned on it every single day and throughout the nights. It would constantly need to be stoked and cleaned as well. The partition surrounding the outer court set the boundary of the workings of the tabernacle and separated it from the common status of everything that surrounded it. What lessons can we learn from these things? I can immediately think of a few. Hit the pause button and tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Welcome to the first 5-Minute Torah under the umbrella of Shalom Macon. I wanted to welcome those who are experiencing the 5-Minute Torah for the first time and hope this series becomes a part of your weekly routine as you study the weekly Torah portions. I also want to welcome my Torah tribe who have made the shift with me from a Minute Torah channel here to the Shalom Macon channel. It's great to finally have these two ministries under one roof, so to speak. I'm excited to bring a whole new collection of videos to our Shalomies across the world. These 5-Minute Torah videos are my first in many more video resources that I'll be creating here at Shalom Macon. I hope these nuggets are an asset to your weekly studies, and I look forward to bringing you other videos on topics that you've been asking about as soon as possible. Now, let's get into the Torah portion. This week's Torah commentary is called The Forest Hidden Behind the Trees and comes from my book, 5-Minute Torah, Volume 2. Parshat Terumah, or Torah portion Terumah, opens with God giving Moses instructions for building the Mishkan, the Holy Tabernacle. When reading through this section of the Torah and the portions that follow, it's easy to get overwhelmed with all of the details given that describe how the tabernacle was to be constructed. We read about the planks of acacia wood, gold, silver, bronze, multicolored yarn, linen, goat's hair, ram skins, and more. We read that each individual item had to be so many cubits wide or so many handbreadths thick. Many people are tempted to skip over these details and fast forward to where the story picks up, so to speak. But we need to remember the significance of what we are reading. These instructions served as the blueprints for Moses and the children of Israel to build this incredible structure called the tabernacle. They needed to have detailed instructions so that the pieces would come together to create something spectacular. However, one particular detail at the beginning of these instructions is easy to overlook. When God tells Moses that he wants the children of Israel to build a dwelling place for him, he says something unusual. Exodus 25:8 begins by saying, "And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in." We would expect the final word to be it. God wants the children of Israel to build him a house that he can dwell in, right? But that's not how it ends. The last Hebrew word of that sentence is betocham, which means in them or among them. Therefore, the passage reads, "And let them make a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst." In other words, the physical structure of the tabernacle was not an end in itself. It was to facilitate a relationship between God and his people. God didn't need a house to live in. He needed a place for his presence to permeate this world through his people. This temporary structure was eventually made into a permanent one. Through the guidance of King David and the direct supervision of his son Solomon, the tabernacle was replaced with the magnificent structure we call the Holy Temple. But even then, King Solomon knew that God could not be contained in a structure made by man. In his dedication prayer for the inauguration of the temple, he said, "But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I've built?" And this is from 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 27. Although the Lord's presence cannot ever be contained in a physical structure, we learn from our sages and the Apostle Paul that we can build a sanctuary for his presence on levels other than the physical. Paul tells us one of these ways by connecting these two ideas in his letter to the Corinthians. He reminds them that they collectively represent an expression of the Holy Temple. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy and you are that temple. 1 Corinthians 3:16 and 17. No, they had not replaced the holy temple built by Solomon, the one that God's presence filled up upon its dedication. Paul's merely using metaphoric language to convey his point. But they had displayed the indwelling of the Spirit of God in an undeniable way, and therefore they could be seen as a sanctuary for his presence. When Paul says you are God's temple, it's in the plural. He's saying that corporately they embody the holy temple because they represent the initial intent of God's sanctuary on earth. It's the same for us. By ourselves, we are like the individual materials used to build the original sanctuary. Only when we are joined together do we become the holy house of God. Sometimes we get so focused on our own personal relationship with God that we lose sight of the larger picture of our faith. We forget that individually we are not the whole. Only when we come together as the body of Messiah do we become the holy house in which his presence dwells. I'm not God's sanctuary. You are not God's sanctuary. He wants to build a sanctuary within us together. Yes, God reveals himself to the world through individuals, but only through a people can he do his greatest work. When we come together and are unified as the people of God, the world will be able to see the forest hidden behind the trees. Well, in this case, the hidden tabernacle of God. Let's work together to make sure they see the dwelling of God on earth in us. Thank you so much for watching. If you're new to Shalom Macon, I highly recommend that you watch our teaching series entitled The Jewish Jesus. Just click on the link on your screen or below in the description to get started in this foundational 6-part series. And if you're like many others around the world, you may not be a part of a local congregation for whatever reason and are hungry for fellowship. Shalom Macon is not only a place for Jews and Gentiles to gather physically, but it's a thriving online community as well. If you want to connect with a balanced community of like-minded Messianic believers who will support your Messianic walk with a growing number of Messianic resources, then I encourage you to connect with us either online or in person. If you don't know it already, we live stream our services every Shabbat. We have a liturgical prayer and Torah service at 9 a.m. Eastern and a contemporary service at 11 a.m. Eastern every Saturday. You can also connect with us on our website at shalommacon.org. From there, you can learn all about Shalom Macon and find ways to connect with others from all around the world. I look forward to seeing you back here next week for another Messianic insight into the eternal Torah of God. Blessings from Shalom Macon, where disciples grow.